Alright, let's start with country interface. We know that each author is assigned one country, but of course there can be many authors from each country. So it's one-to-many relationship. So I'm going to create a class in the services folder and I'll call it iCountryRepository GUI. I'm adding the suffix GUI to the name of the class to make sure we don't confuse our repositories with the ones in the API project. So in the services, I right-click, add, new class, and like I said, I'll call it iCountryRepository GUI. However, we don't want this to be a class, we want this to be an interface, so I'll change the word class to interface. So what methods do we need to work with the countries records? Well, we need to be able to retrieve the countries. Now remember, the API itself returns a simplified object called DTO. So what we need is access these DTO classes from the API. So in the case of retrieving all the countries, we return IEnumerable of country DTO class. So the return type will be IEnumerable of DTO class for the country, and I'll call it getCountries. But you can see we do not have access to the country DTO, and since we are using a separate project, we need to add a reference to the API in our project. In real life, this would be probably a DLL library, but we would need to add a reference the same way. So I'll go to Solution Explorer, and to add a reference for our purposes, I'll simply right-click the dependencies in the book GUI project over here and add a reference. And here we only have one project available, which is the API itself. So I'll select that and click OK. So when I open the dependencies and projects, you can see I have the book API project linked to our book GUI project. So with the reference added, we can now access the classes in the API. So when I hover over the country DTO, I can now bring in the namespace using book API projects.dtos. That's where country DTO class resides. Alright, so that's our first method. Next, we want to be able to retrieve a single country by passing the country ID to it. On the website, you can picture it as a link to the country details, and the link will pass the country ID, and in the view, based on that ID, we will display the information for that country. So the second method will return country DTO object, and I'll call it getCountryById. And like I said, we need to actually send the country ID into this method in order to retrieve the country information. So next, we also want to retrieve information of a country of a specific author. In this case, we get the country info by passing the author's ID. So we will again return country DTO, and I'll call it getCountry of an author. And since we are returning a country of a specific author, we need to know what the author is, so we will pass in the author ID. And we also want to retrieve all authors of a specific country, so in this case, we will pass in the country ID and retrieve a list of all authors from that country. So we'll retrieve IEnumerable of author DTO, and I'll call it get authors from a country. And we'll pass in the integer of the country from which we want to retrieve the authors. Now, of course, we also want to be able to create, delete, and edit country. However, we do not need these methods in the interface. These are specific methods that will be used only in the countries controller. The interface simply needs to have all the HTTP GET methods so that we can mix and match data between different tables, as I explained previously. And creating, deleting, and editing records does not need to be passed around, as for example, creating a country will not be mixed with creating an author. The two operations are completely independent of each other. So to keep the interfaces light, we will only use them for getting the records, while the rest of the CRUD operations will be done individually for each of the classes. Alright, our first interface is finished. Next, let's create a category interface.